Hello and welcome to this video where we'll be discussing the color settings that you need to enter into each of the three programs that we'll be using in our post-processing. So that's Adobe Lightroom, Photoshop and Camera Raw. So we're going to start off with Camera Raw, and here we can see an image that's been opened into Camera Raw, and at the bottom here we have a description. It says what the color spaces and some other information. So let's just click on that. Now there are three settings here that you need to make. One is the color space. We can click on here and we can see we have a choice of different things, but what we want to be able to select here is Pro Photo. The next thing we have to select is bit depth, so we should be choosing 16 bits, and that will give us the most number of colors and tones in the image that we import. The next thing to set up is resolution. Mine's set to 360, and the reason being is that 360 is the native resolution of the Epson color printers that we use. If you're using a Canon, you need to set this to 300. You click OK, and it's important to come down to the bottom right hand corner here and click Done. That will commit the changes permanently. Okay, so we click Done. Right, let's go into Photoshop. Let's just open up an image like this one. So we'll open this in Photoshop. So for this in Photoshop, we need to go into Edit, Color Settings. Okay, and in here we set again the color space to Pro Photo RGB, and we need to set these color management policies, and they should all be preserve embedded profiles. And for profile mismatches, ask when opening, when pasting, and for missing profiles, ask when opening. The rendering intent should be defaulted to relative color metric, and you should click these other settings here, particularly use black point compensation, and we click OK. Just to illustrate the profile mismatches, you would have seen that when I open this in Photoshop, it will come up with oh, I need to close it first. Let's go back to that. When we open that in Photoshop, okay, let's open it in Photoshop, it comes up with this profile mismatch error message. Well, it's not an error message per se, it's a warning. It's saying that the embedded profile is Adobe RGB 98. So that's how the image was originally processed. So it's quite an old image, and that's what was used back then. But the working profile, the profile that we've set Photoshop to be, has been set to Pro Photo RGB. So we have a choice here. We can use the embedded profile, so stick with Adobe RGB for this particular image, or we could convert it to Pro Photo RGB, or indeed we could just discard the profile and don't color manage. So you're not going to gain anything by trying to upscale this from Adobe 98 to Pro Photo, so I would just leave as is and click OK, and we'll be operating for this one image alone in Adobe 98. Let's move on to Lightroom. In Lightroom, as you know, when we're in the develop module, we may well use photo edit in Photoshop. Okay, now Lightroom has a color space, a default color space of Pro Photo. In fact, it's a derivative of Pro Photo called Melissa, but essentially it's Pro Photo, and you can't change that. But what we do want to make sure is that when we communicate with other programs, we communicate in the right way. So let's have a look at that. So we go into Lightroom Preferences, and in here we have External Editing. Now, when we edit in Adobe Photoshop, here it is at the top here, we want to say when you send this photo to Photoshop, make sure that the color space Pro Photo is associated with it. Again, we could have been Adobe RGB, but we want Pro Photo. The bit depth should also be 16 bits, and the resolution should be 360, or if you're printing on a Canon, 300. If you have other external editors, then you should set these to be exactly the same. Color space as Pro Photo, bit depth 16, and resolution 360. And click OK. Now everything we have in our workflow is now set to Pro Photo, 360 DPI, and 16-bit depth. So we're getting the maximum colors and tones possible throughout the whole chain of our post-processing. And just a side note, by the way, you should also set your camera to be the biggest bit depth possible. So that should be 16 bits as well. Sometimes it's 14 bits. Many modern cameras, you don't get a choice. They just default to 16 bits. But Canons and Nikons, you can normally, in the menus, select whether this should be 14 or 8 or 16 even. And of course, you should always select the biggest bit depth. So we're capturing at the biggest bit depth and bringing it into our post-processing environment, Lightroom, Photoshop, and Adobe Camera Raw. And ultimately, when we come to print, we'll be printing at 16-bit on our Canon or our Epson printers. And there we have it. That's the basic color management settings that you need to have in place to do your post-processing.